The Python War. How a failed robot army accidentally cracked the Everglades code. Hook, open in medias res. The camera feed was live. A biologist sat in a dark monitoring station 40 miles from the swamp, watching a screen. It was 2:47 a.m. She had been watching these feeds for 3 weeks. She had seen pythons. She had seen raccoons. She had seen nothing particularly surprising. Then the feed from Unit 47 flickered. What stepped into frame wasn't a python. It wasn't even close. The room didn't go quiet because of what they saw. It went quiet because of what it meant. Because in that single moment, in that grainy, heat-blurred night vision rectangle, the entire 3-year, multi-million-dollar project had just transformed into something nobody had designed it to be. The robot rabbits had failed. But they had found something far more dangerous than a snake. Part 1. The invader that humans built. Here is the truth nobody wants to say out loud. The Everglades wasn't invaded. It was infected. And the needle that delivered the virus was held by a human hand. In the 1980s and 1990s, Burmese pythons were sold at exotic pet fairs across Florida. They were beautiful geometric scales of brown and gold, small enough to coil in a child's palm. Buyers didn't ask questions. Sellers didn't volunteer answers. Those snakes grew. Not slowly. Fast. Shockingly fast. Within a few years, a snake that fit in a shoebox was pressing its head against the ceiling of a guest bedroom. 15 feet. Sometimes 20. Heavy enough to snap a man's arm. Powerful enough to crush the chest of a white-tailed deer. Owners had 2 choices. Pay for an enclosure they couldn't afford, or open a back door. Most open the door. Once they're released, they're not going back. These animals have survived millions of years of evolution. A Florida swamp? That's a 5-star hotel for a Burmese python. Wildlife biologist? Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Then came 1992. Hurricane Andrew didn't just tear roofs from houses. It tore walls from reptile breeding facilities. Dozens of enclosures, maybe hundreds, were breached in a single night. No one knows how many snakes escaped. No one was counting. Those escaped animals found the Everglades. And the Everglades had no idea what was coming. The ecosystem there was ancient, balanced, and completely unprepared. For tens of thousands of years, nothing had hunted like a Burmese python hunted. There was no instinct built into the nervous system of a Florida marsh rabbit that said, freeze when something 150 pounds wraps around you from the dark. There was no evolutionary memory of it. So they didn't run. And the pythons ate everything. Part 2. The math of catastrophe. Let's be precise about the damage. Because the numbers are not metaphors. They are autopsies. In regions of the Everglades where pythons have become dominant, raccoon populations have dropped by over 90%. Possum populations gone. Marsh rabbits functionally erased from large stretches of habitat. One study tracked bobcats through radio collars for years, logging their movements across thousands of acres. After pythons arrived in force, the signal from those collars simply stopped appearing. Not because the bobcats left, because there were no more bobcats to track. One large python, captured and necropsied, was found to contain an entire adult white-tailed deer inside its body. Another, filmed in open water, locked in a death spiral with an American alligator, a predator that has ruled Florida swamps for 37 million years. The fight lasted hours. Both animals died. Think about that. A species that arrived 40 years ago is now fighting the apex predator of an ancient ecosystem to a standstill. And winning often enough to matter. The collapse doesn't stop at the animals you can see. Remove the raccoons, and the eggs of ground-nesting birds have no predators. Populations surge unnaturally, then crash. Remove the scavengers and decay rates shift, altering soil chemistry, altering what grows. Remove the small mammals, and the hawks and owls that depended on them begin to starve. A food web isn't a list. It's a suspension bridge. Pull enough cables and the whole structure drops. Biologists now estimate the python population in South Florida at somewhere between tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. The range on that estimate tells you everything you need to know about how well we understand the problem. We don't. Part 3. Every strategy that failed. They tried the obvious things first. The Python Challenge, 2013. Public hunting event. Cash prizes. Media coverage. Thousands of participants with airboats, flashlights, and machetes, flooding into the swamp on a mission. After weeks of effort across hundreds of thousands of acres, the total harvest was 68 snakes. 68. Against a population potentially in the hundreds of thousands. It was a PR event, not a science event. We knew going in the numbers wouldn't move the needle, but the public needed to feel like something was happening. Anonymous Florida wildlife official. It was theater. They moved to professionals. The Python elimination program paid licensed hunters an hourly rate plus bonuses for every snake removed. Real hunters, real effort, real expense. Millions of dollars in contractor fees, night patrols along the levees, trained eyes scanning the dark water. The math was still brutal. The Everglades covers 1.5 million acres. Hiring enough humans to meaningfully patrol that area would cost more than the entire state wildlife budget several times over. They tried Judas snakes, fitting large female pythons with radio transmitters, then releasing them to lead hunters back to breeding aggregations. It worked sometimes. It wasn't enough. The problem was always the same. The swamp was too big. The snakes were too good at hiding. And every snake removed was replaced by the offspring of the snakes that remained. A single female Burmese python can lay up to 100 eggs per clutch. Then she leaves, and the cycle begins again. One snake, one season, up to 100 new hunters in the swamp. The arithmetic was a nightmare. They needed a different kind of weapon. Part 4. The dog that changed the equation. Their names were Truman and Eleanor. Truman was a black Labrador, broad-headed, endlessly patient, with the kind of friendly face that made you forget he was a precision instrument. Eleanor was a Dutch shepherd, lean and alert, bred for tracking and detection work. For months, they were trained on a single scent, the faint, musky chemical signature left behind by Burmese pythons on vegetation, soil, and water. A scent so subtle that no human nose registers it at all. A scent that lingers in the grass for hours after a snake has passed. When they were deployed into the Everglades, the results were immediate. A dog has a 100 times better chance than us at finding a snake. We can only find one if we see it. The dog can smell where it was 2 hours ago. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission handler. Truman's tail would go rigid. Eleanor would drop her nose and begin a slow, tight circle, then freeze. And the handler's flashlight would swing, and somewhere in the sawgrass or beneath a cypress root, scales would catch the light. They were finding snakes in minutes that search teams had missed for days. In one documented success, Truman located an 8-foot Burmese python in the Rocky Glades public small game hunting area in Miami-Dade County. A snake that had not been detected by any previous patrol. But here is where excitement collides with reality. The Everglades is 1.5 million acres. 2 dogs, even exceptional dogs, cannot cover 1.5 million acres. To meaningfully deploy canine detection across the full range, wildlife managers estimated they would need hundreds of dog handler teams, each requiring thousands of hours of training, constant veterinary support, cooling equipment for heat protection, and protective boots against sawgrass. The dogs wore cooling vests. They wore rubber boots. In the summer heat, temperatures routinely exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit with crushing humidity, they could only work in short rotations before. The environment became dangerous. Truman and Eleanor proved the concept. Scent was the key. The python could be tracked not by its presence, but by its smell. The question became, how do you scale scent? Part 5. The rabbit that wasn't alive. Before the robots, there were real rabbits. Wildlife managers, building on the logic of scent-based detection, ran controlled experiments with live marsh rabbits, the python's natural prey in Florida. They built secure enclosures, placed the rabbits inside, and positioned the pens along high-traffic corridors in the swamp. The results were not ambiguous. Pythons found the enclosures with alarming speed. Camera after camera captured the same footage. A massive constrictor approaching slowly, tongue flicking at the air, then coiling against the cage wire. It worked. The moral calculus didn't. Images of trembling rabbits surrounded by 15-foot constrictors spread quickly. Animal welfare organizations condemned the program. The public pressure was immediate and overwhelming. Funding was pulled. The experiment was terminated. They couldn't use living bait, so they decided to build a living animal that wasn't alive. The project was called the Robo-Rabbit. Each unit was a feat of practical engineering. Weatherproof casing, synthetic fur. Inside, a thermal pad that maintained a constant temperature of 99 degrees Fahrenheit, the precise body temperature of a living marsh rabbit. Chemical emitters released a synthetic compound replicating rabbit musk. Some models had small motors that made the ears and nose twitch. To a python's heat-sensing pit organs, to its chemical-detecting tongue. This was a rabbit. Each unit cost approximately $4,000 to manufacture. Each one contained a motion-triggered camera, a thermal imager, and a wireless transmitter. When anything approached, the system activated and sent an alert to biologists stationed miles away. And powering it all. A small solar panel on top, allowing continuous operation for weeks without maintenance. 120 units were manufactured and deployed across known python corridors. The goal wasn't to harm the snakes. It was to draw them into monitored zones where we could respond within minutes. We thought we had finally found the answer. Project Engineer, Florida Python Initiative. The first 2 days were extraordinary. Part 6. When everything worked, and then didn't. The alerts began pinging almost immediately after deployment. Field cameras captured footage that no one had seen before at this scale. Multiple large pythons, some exceeding 15 feet, converging on the decoy pens within hours of placement. Tongues flicking, bodies coiling. The thermal signature of the robots was indistinguishable from a living animal to a snake's senses. Response teams moved in. Snake after snake was captured and removed. In the first 48 hours, the program appeared to be working better than any previous intervention in the history of Florida python management. Then came day 3, an alert from a unit near a deep-water canal. The monitoring biologist pulled up the feed expecting a python. What she saw instead was a shape, dark, moving fast along the bank. A 12-foot American alligator. It wasn't confused. It wasn't investigating out of curiosity. It was hunting. The robot rabbit's thermal signature. 99 degrees, perfectly still, slightly twitching. Looked exactly like a small, injured animal sitting in the open. In one explosive movement, the alligator charged the enclosure and crushed the $4,000 unit in a single bite. The room went quiet, not because of what they saw, because of what it meant. The same sensory triggers that fooled a python, heat, chemical scent, subtle movement, fooled every predator in the Everglades. And what had just entered the experiment wasn't a complicating factor. It was a war. Pythons and alligators are ancient competitors. They overlap in habitat, in prey, and in ambition. For millions of years, they have fought, sometimes to the death, for dominance in the same shallow water. And now 120 flashing, heated, musk-emitting signals had been dropped into the middle of their shared territory. The alligators found the robots first. Faster, more mobile in open water, they began systematically destroying the units, crushing them, dragging them, battering them against cypress roots. Within days, dozens had been destroyed. And the pythons? The pythons felt the presence of the alligators moving through those corridors. And they turned away. The trap had become the warning system. The bait had become the danger sign. The project was failing in real time. Part 7. The secret in the wreckage. They were about to pull the plug. The math was impossible. Robots destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Alligators learning to patrol the deployment zones. Pythons rerouting around the very corridors the system was designed to monitor. A program that had cost millions was collapsing under the weight of its own unintended consequences. Then a young data analyst on the team noticed something. She had been reviewing the raw logs from the surviving units, not the units that had been attacked, but the ones that hadn't. The ones that sat quietly in the dark, recording everything that passed by without triggering a snake or an alligator. The robots weren't just bait. They were cameras. They were thermal sensors. They were motion trackers. And for weeks, in positions scattered across 120 different locations throughout the most inaccessible terrain in North America, they had been silently recording everything. Every movement, every direction of travel, every time of night, every temperature, every interaction. Not just the pythons that attacked, the pythons that passed, the pythons that turned around, the pythons that approached and retreated, the alligators, the patterns. We realized we hadn't built a trap. We'd built a spy network. The robots failed at catching snakes, but they had been watching the entire swamp for weeks. Every animal that moved past those cameras, we had the data. Data analyst, Everglades Python Monitoring Project. She started building maps. By cross-referencing the timestamps, GPS coordinates, and directional movement data from all 120 units, something began to emerge on her screen that no one had ever seen before. The pythons weren't moving randomly. They were using corridors. Specific, consistent, repeated pathways through the sawgrass and waterways. Routes that appeared again and again in the data, traveled by different snakes at different times, in the same direction, along the same lines through the terrain. Hidden highways. The swamp had a road system, and until that moment, no human had ever known it existed. Part 8. The AI that learned to think like a predator. The dataset went into a machine learning system. Every data point from every surviving unit, movement vectors, temperature gradients, time of day frequency, the relationship between alligator patrol routes and python avoidance patterns. The AI was given one directive: find the structure. Found it. The AI didn't just map where the pythons moved. It modeled why they moved. Here was the discovery that changed everything. The pythons weren't following food. They were following safety. The hidden highway system was a predator avoidance map, a network of routes that minimized exposure to alligators. For years, researchers had assumed python movements were driven by prey availability. The data said something colder. The pythons were afraid. They had memorized the patrol patterns of alligators in their territory. They moved through gaps in those patterns, specific windows of time, specific routes through the terrain, calculated to minimize the chance of encounter. The swamp that looked like chaos from above had, at the level of individual predator behavior, a precise and navigable logic. The AI could predict that logic. Not perfectly, not with certainty, but with enough accuracy to change the game. We fed in 3 weeks of raw data and asked it where a 14-foot female would be at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in July. And it gave us a coordinate. We drove to that coordinate. She was there. Field Coordinator Python AI Tracking Program. Part 9. The hunt that changed everything. The hunters stopped waiting. That was the first shift. For years, every python removal program had been reactive: deploy bait, wait, respond to alerts, hope a snake came to you. The swamp was too big to search. The snakes were too good at hiding. You could only catch them when they moved toward something. The AI inverted that. Now the hunters moved toward the snakes. They used the predicted corridors to position intercept teams before the pythons arrived. They weren't responding to sightings. They were laying ambushes at coordinates that hadn't triggered yet. Places the model said a python would pass in the next 2 to 4 hours. The results in the first month of the new system were staggering. Not one snake at a time. Groups. Multiple animals converging on the same predicted route simultaneously, because the same logic that drove one python down a corridor drove them all. But the decisive breakthrough wasn't the corridors. It was the females. The AI, tracking the movement signatures of large adult females, had identified something specific in their behavioral patterns in late winter and early spring. The predictive model began pointing not to random corridors, but to specific fixed locations. sites where the movement data converged repeatedly, where large females spent extended periods without traveling further. Breeding aggregations, hidden nesting sites, buried deep in terrain that no patrol had ever reached. Not because the terrain was impassable, but because no one had ever known to look there. The teams found dozens of large females gathered in single locations, and with them, thousands upon thousands of eggs. In the first month of AI-guided operations, the program removed more invasive pythons from the Everglades than the entire previous year of the bounty hunting program had produced. 1 month. Against 1 full year, the robots had failed to catch snakes. But in failing, they had built the most complete behavioral map of an invasive predator ever assembled. The failure had become the intelligence. Outro. The war isn't over. Here is what we know now. The AI map is real. The highways are real. The breeding grounds are real. The scale of removal since the program shifted to predictive interception has been, by any historical measure, unprecedented. But the pythons are still there. Tens of thousands of them, maybe more. Still breeding. Still eating. Still spreading. Slowly, steadily, northward into new territory as Florida's climate shifts. The model improves with every new data point. But the swamp is one. 5 million acres of the most difficult terrain on the continent, and a snake that can survive inside a flooded marsh, that can go months without eating, that can pass through a gap the width of a human fist. That snake does not give up easily. The live rabbit experiments were shut down by public pressure. The robot program was nearly canceled after the alligator attacks. The AI integration was funded on a shoestring by a team that almost nobody took seriously at the time. Every breakthrough in this story came from a failure that someone refused to abandon. The question no one can answer yet is this: is the python smarter than the model? These animals have survived for tens of millions of years. They have outlasted ice ages, continental drift, mass extinction events. They have adapted to every environment their species has ever encountered. The Everglades is just the latest. The AI learns from the data, but the snakes learn from the pressure. Every hunting season that removes the most accessible, most predictable animals leaves behind the ones that were harder to find. The ones that moved differently. The ones whose behavior didn't fit the model. Evolution doesn't need a computer. It just needs time. So here is the question we leave you with. Did we just find the weapon that saves the Everglades? Or did we just begin training the next generation of pythons to be invisible? Drop your prediction in the comments. Because the scientists monitoring those feeds right now don't know the answer either. And neither do we.